The knock came at 11:30 on a Tuesday in November. 3 measured raps against the oak, deliberate, unhurried. The sound of a man who had never in his life been made to wait. Inside the East Wing bedchamber, Lady Corinna Calder, Duchess of Dunmore, did not move. She sat at her writing desk in the amber glow of a single oil lamp, her pen suspended over a half-finished letter to the Royal Botanical Society, a letter, if approved, that would see her research on medicinal hedgerow plants published under her own name for the very first time, not anonymous, not attributed to a gentleman correspondent, hers. The knock came again. She set the pen down with the same studied patience one might use to lay a sword beside a sleeping enemy. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the door, not with fear, not with longing, but with the quiet, terrible clarity of a woman who had spent 5 years learning the precise weight of silence. She knew his step in the corridor. She had memorized it against her will in those first bewildering months of marriage, the way a captive memorizes the sound of approaching footsteps, cataloguing whether they intend harm or indifference. Edmund Calder's boots fell heavy and even, a soldier's gait, some said, a general's, said others. Corinna had always thought it the gait of a man who had decided long ago that the world would accommodate itself to him. On the 3rd of January, 5 years prior, he had escorted her to the door of this very room, bowed with exacting formality, and said, in the same tone one might use to dismiss a parliamentary clerk, "You will find the arrangements adequate, I trust." He had not knocked since, until now. The fire crackled. Rain needled the window glass. Somewhere in the house, a long case clock struck the quarter hour. Corinna picked up her pen. She did not answer. And in the corridor beyond the locked door, His Grace the Duke of Dunmore stood in the dark, and for the first time in his life felt the particular humiliation of a door that would not open. To understand why the Duchess did not answer, you must first understand who she was before the door was ever locked. Corinna Vane had arrived in London society at 17 with ink-stained fingers, a notebook tucked into her reticule, and a habit of correcting gentlemen mid-sentence that her mother described as a catastrophic social affliction. She was the 3rd daughter of a country vicar, with more books than income, and more opinions than was considered safe in a female. She was not celebrated for her beauty, though her eyes, a particular shade of grey-green like sea-glass caught in winter light, had a way of seeing through pretension that unnerved men who were accustomed to being looked at rather than looked through. She laughed too loudly. She asked too many questions. She had once, memorably, argued crop rotation with a viscount at a dinner party until he excused himself to the card-room purely to escape her. She was, in short, considered difficult. Edmund Calder, 5th Duke of Dunmore, had not married her for her conversation. He had married her because his late mother's will demanded he take a wife of good moral character before his 35th year, or forfeit the management of the Dunmore estates to a board of trustees he despised. Corinna, with her clergyman's pedigree and her scandalously unblemished reputation, had fit the legal requirement precisely. The fact that she was 22 and vibrant, and clearly intended for a life larger than the one he could offer her, this he had not allowed himself to consider. He was 34. He had survived 2 years in the peninsula. He had buried his father and brother in the same winter. He had rebuilt Dunmore from near ruin through 10 years of unrelenting, joyless work. He was not a man who trafficked in considerations. So he had offered, she had accepted, because her family needed the security, and because young Corinna had believed, with the ferocious optimism of someone who had not yet been truly disappointed, that she could reach any man who was willing to be reached. She had been wrong. He had been colder than November stone, more distant than the northern counties his estates occupied. And so, over 5 years, something extraordinary had happened. Corinna Vane had stopped trying to reach him, and had built, quietly and defiantly, an entire inner life of her own. A published paper, a small school for tenant girls, a correspondence that spanned 3 continents, a locked door. Now Edmund Calder stood on the other side of it, his knuckles still warm from knocking, discovering, perhaps for the first time, that a woman's patience is not the same thing as her surrender. The story of what happened next begins not with his knock. It begins with what finally made him raise his hand to that door at all. He had not intended to knock. That is the truth of it, though Edmund Calder would sooner forfeit Dunmore's north pastures than admit it aloud. It had begun with a letter, not addressed to him, nothing so extraordinary ever was these days, but left in error on his study desk by the new underfootman, a boy of 15 who had not yet learned that the Duke of Dunmore's correspondence and the Duchess's were to be sorted with religious precision into opposite corners of the hall table. The letter bore the crest of the Royal Botanical Society of London. Edmund had moved it aside without reading it, then moved it back. Then, in a moment he would later attribute to simple administrative curiosity, the way a man might check a ledger entry that does not balance, he had opened it. Dear Duchess of Dunmore, it is with the greatest admiration and no small measure of institutional astonishment that the Society writes to confirm the acceptance of your manuscript on the medicinal properties of northern hedgerow flora for publication in our spring quarterly. That such rigorous and original fieldwork has been conducted entirely within the domestic sphere of Dunmore Estate speaks to an extraordinary dedication of purpose. The Society looks forward to correspondence with one of its first female contributors. Edmund had read the letter twice. Then he had sat very still in his leather chair for a long time, while the fire burned low and the autumn dark pressed against the windows of Dunmore Hall like something that wanted in. He had lived in this house for 20 years. He had walked its corridors, managed its accounts, reformed its tenant policies, and rebuilt its reputation with the same methodical thoroughness he had once applied to fortifying positions in the peninsula. He believed, had believed, with the comfortable certainty of a man who has never been contradicted in his own home, that he knew every corner of Dunmore. He had not known about the field work. He had not known about the manuscript. He had not, if he was honest with himself in the particular way that only November darkness and a letter from the Royal Botanical Society could produce, known very much about his wife at all. He tried to remember the last full conversation they had shared. Not the formal exchanges over the solicitor's quarterly reports, not the brief negotiations over which rooms to open for the Hargrove visit. A real conversation, the kind involving actual thoughts. He arrived at their wedding day and found he could not locate a single one after it. He had gone upstairs that night with the letter still in hand. He had stood before the east wing door. He had knocked, and in the silence that followed, that long, deliberate, annihilating silence, Edmund Calder had understood, with the cold shock of a man who steps onto ice he did not know was thin, that his wife had built an entire world inside this house, and had not invited him into a single room of it. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you are not alone. stay with us, because this marriage is about to crack open in the most extraordinary way. Now, let us meet Corinna properly. Corinna Vane had always been at her most herself before the rest of the house woke up. At 5:30 every morning, in all seasons, in all weathers, she rose without the help of her lady's maid, dressed in her oldest wool gown, the brown one with the repaired hem and the ink stain on the left cuff that no amount of laundering had ever fully persuaded to leave, and walked out through the kitchen garden into the northern grounds of Dunmore Estate. She was 27 years old, slight, though wiry with the particular fitness of someone who walks 4 miles daily, not for recreation, but for the pure animal necessity of motion. Her hair was the color of dark honey, not a romantic description, merely an accurate one, and she wore it in a practical knot at the base of her neck that would have made her former governess weep. Her hands, which society required to be gloved at all social hours, were bare at dawn and bore the evidence of her true occupation: earth under the fingernails on Monday, plant press stains on Thursday, and on the 1st of every month a small callus on her right middle finger from a full day's writing.
Her face was not fashionably pretty. It was better than that. It was readable. Every thought she had moved across it like weather, which was precisely why she had learned, in 5 years of marriage to an unreadable man, to school it into perfect stillness in his presence. This morning she carried a canvas satchel and a small iron trowel, and made for the northern hedgerow where she had been cataloguing the late-season growth of Viburnum lantana, wayfaring tree, for 6 weeks. The sky was iron and violet, the ground exhaling the last warmth of the previous day, the air carrying the mineral sharpness of coming frost. She was crouching in the damp grass, recording measurements in her field notebook in her small, precise hand, when she heard a footstep on the gravel behind her. Not a servant's step, too heavy, too deliberate. She did not turn around. "You are not dressed for this temperature," said Edmund. 5 years had not altered his voice. It was the same low register, the same economy of feeling, as though each word were rationed and he intended no waste. "Neither observation nor prescription was requested, Your Grace," Corinna replied, and drew a careful diagram of the berry cluster in the margin of her notebook. A pause. The gravel shifted. "The letter from the Botanical Society," he said. "It was opened in error." "I assumed as much." She turned a page. "You are not, as a rule, interested in hedgerow flora." Another pause. Longer. She could feel him looking at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture one has walked past daily for years and suddenly noticed is not, in fact, a chair. "Corinna, I will be inside before breakfast," she said pleasantly. "Good morning, Your Grace." She heard him stand a moment longer. Then the gravel sounded his retreat. She did not look up until he was gone. Then she pressed her ink-stained hand flat against the cold earth and breathed out very slowly. He had used her given name. In 5 years she could count the occasions on one hand. Something has just begun to shift in Dunmore Hall, though neither of them would dare to name it yet. Don't miss what happens next, and if you know someone who loves a story about a woman who refuses to be invisible, share this with them right now. The village of Dunmore-under-Fell had 43 children under the age of 12. 11 of them were girls. Of those 11, Corinna had managed, through a campaign of quiet, persistent, and thoroughly undocumented negotiation with their fathers, to secure the attendance of 9 of them at the small school she ran on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the disused north wing parlor of the hall. The Duke of Dunmore did not know the school existed.
This was not, strictly speaking, deception. Corinna had simply never mentioned it, and Edmund had simply never asked what she did with the rooms that had been given over to her management in the first year of their marriage. She had interpreted management with the fullest possible generosity of definition. On this particular Thursday, she stood before 9 girls ranging in age from 6 to 13, her back straight, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being ignored by the powerful and therefore doubly committed to being heard by the powerless. "Millicent, read the next line." Millicent Forge, aged 8, with a gap in her front teeth and the fierce concentration of a natural scholar, bent over her primer. "The ship sailed at dawn." "Very good. Harriet, next line." The lesson proceeded in that bright, imperfect, wholly alive manner of genuine learning. Corinna's teaching style bore no resemblance to the instruction she had received at the hands of her own governess. There was no memorization by rote, no emphasis on the deportment of the female mind towards submission and ornament. There was arithmetic, there was geography, there was, on the first Thursday of each month, a nature lesson conducted in the kitchen garden where the girls were permitted to ask any question they liked. Last month, young Harriet Moss had asked why the sky went green before a storm. Corinna had spent 45 magnificent minutes explaining it. She did not hear the door. She did not hear the footstep. It was Millicent who looked up first, her eyes going round as coat buttons. Corinna turned. Edmund stood in the doorway of the north wing parlour, one hand still on the doorframe, his tall figure entirely filling the space. He had clearly come from his morning business. He wore his riding coat still, his dark hair carrying the particular disarray of a man who has been out in wind, and his expression was the unreadable granite it always was. Except around the eyes. There, in that careful, controlled face, there was something Corinna had never seen before in 5 years of studying him from across formal dinner tables. Pure bewilderment. 9 small girls stared up at the Duke of Dunmore. The Duke of Dunmore stared at the 9 small girls. "Your Grace," Corinna said, with exquisite composure, "we are in the middle of a reading lesson. Were you looking for the east staircase? It is the next door along." He did not, for several seconds, appear to hear her. "How long," he finally said, his voice slightly altered from its usual texture, rougher, quieter, "has this been happening?" Corinna tilted her head with the mild, pleasant expression she had perfected for exactly these moments. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days, she said. "Shall I show you the attendance register?" 9 little girls just changed the course of a duke's entire understanding of his own household. And the story is only just getting started. Kindly subscribe now if you haven't, because this story is about to grow much larger than a locked door. He found her in the library at 2:30. Of all the rooms in Dunmore Hall, the library was the one they had tacitly agreed, without ever discussing it, in the manner of 2 people who have developed an elaborate territorial treaty through pure avoidance, belonged to him. 12,000 volumes, a fire that burned from October to April, a desk the size of a small continent, and the distinct and particular atmosphere of masculine authority undisturbed by domestic complication. Corinna was sitting in his chair. She had a botanical text open on the desk before her, was making notes in her cramped handwriting in the margins of her own notebook, and had removed her shoes, tucking her stocked feet beneath her, with the casual sovereignty of a woman in her own sitting room who sees no particular reason to justify her comfort. She looked up when he entered. Her expression was composed and entirely without apology. "I needed Parkinson's Theatrum Botanicum," she said. "Your shelving system is bewildering. You have organized them by the color of the spines." "I have organized them," Edmund said, with careful precision, "by the frequency with which I consult them. The color is incidental."
She returned to her notes. A fascinating organizational philosophy, though one that requires an external party to have intimate knowledge of your internal cognitive habits in order to locate anything. Very efficient for solitary use. Edmund stood in the center of his library and experienced the unusual and mildly vertiginous sensation of being managed by someone who appeared not to be managing him at all. He crossed to the chair opposite, the smaller one, the one that was not his, and sat. "The school," he said. Corinna finished her sentence before answering. "Yes." "You did not ask permission." "I did not require permission to use rooms assigned to my management." She turned a page with the air of someone for whom this is a matter already fully resolved. "I checked. The original household agreement quite clearly states, 'I am not interested in the legality of it.'" She looked up at him properly then, her grey-green eyes, the color of lichen on northern stone, he thought, with the slightly fractured quality of a man whose mind is producing observations he has not requested, held no apology and no performance, only the level, clear attention of a woman who has decided to let a conversation go wherever it honestly needs to go. "Then what are you interested in, Your Grace?" "I am interested," he said, and the word required an unusual effort of will, "in why you did not tell me." The fire cracked between them. Outside, rain had begun its long grey work against the library windows, dragging itself down the glass in streaks that blurred the view of the grounds to a watercolor approximation of itself. "Would you have said yes?" she asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. The question sat between them in the firelight, with the particular weight of something that has been waiting to be asked for considerably longer than the conversation that finally produced it. He looked at his wife, at the ink on her cuff, the notebook under her hand, the bare stockinged feet tucked beneath her in his chair, and understood, with a precision that was new and not entirely comfortable, that he had spent 5 years sharing a house with a person he had made no meaningful effort to know, and that the honest answer to her question was the most revealing thing he had said in 5 years of marriage. "I don't know," he said at last. It was the most honest thing he had said to her since their wedding day. Corinna appeared to understand this, appeared to receive it for what it actually was rather than what it sounded like, because for just a moment the perfect composure of her expression altered, not toward softness exactly, toward something less defended, a lowering of the careful guard so brief he might, in other circumstances, have missed it entirely. "No," she said equally quietly, "neither do I." She gathered her notebook and Parkinson's Theatrum Botanicum, rose from his chair, and walked to the door in her stockinged feet with the unhurried dignity of a woman who has made her point and requires nothing further from the room. At the threshold she paused, her back still to him. "The next lesson is Tuesday," she said. "Should you wish to observe, the parlor is the door before the east staircase. A beat. You walked past it this morning." She left. Edmund sat in the silence she had vacated and noticed, for the first time, that his chair smelled faintly of dried lavender and ink, a scent so particular and so completely not his own that it struck him absurdly like the evidence of a life being lived in his house that he had somehow failed to register the existence of. He did not move for a long time.
The rain continued its indifferent work against the glass. The fire burned steadily, illuminating the room, illuminating the smaller chair opposite, illuminating the precise space his wife had occupied in the middle of his library on a rainy Thursday afternoon, in the plain and unremarkable way of a person who belonged somewhere. He had said, "I don't know." He had meant, "I should have known better to make it a question." He sat with the difference between those two things until the fire needed tending, and then he tended it, and then he went to his desk and found he could not concentrate on a single document it held. Lord Piers Gwyn arrived on a Friday, 3 days after the library conversation, aboard a yellow curricle, driven with the reckless good humor of a man who has never had particular occasion to be cautious about anything, and has therefore never developed the habit.
He was 30 years old, the youngest son of the Marquess of Seriog, with warm eyes, an easy manner, and a genuine enthusiasm for the natural sciences that had made him, over 2 years of correspondence with Carina, her most reliable intellectual ally. He had read 3 drafts of the Botanical Society manuscript. He had sent 2 crates of field samples from the Welsh uplands. He had never once, not in 2 years of letters, not in a single line, suggested that her work might benefit from attribution to a gentleman colleague. He was also, by any reasonable accounting, extraordinarily handsome in the uncomplicated way of men who have never needed to earn their looks with seriousness, and have consequently remained entirely at ease within them. Carina met him on the front steps, and the effect was immediate and complete. Her whole face changed. Edmund, crossing the entrance hall on his way to a meeting with his estate manager, stopped walking. He had observed Carina in company before, formal dinners, the occasional assembly in Harrogate. He had watched her perform the careful, muted version of herself that she offered to the world as a functional substitute for the real thing, pleasant, composed, possessed of a cleverness that could be mistaken for mere agreeableness by anyone not paying sufficiently close attention. He had not, until this precise moment, seen her unguarded. She was laughing, not the measured, socially calibrated variety she deployed in drawing rooms, an actual laugh, unpremeditated, unbecoming by every social code of the era, her head tilted back, her hand pressed to her sternum, as though the mirth had arrived with physical force and required containment. Gwyn was gesticulating broadly, clearly mid-anecdote, his traveling coat muddy to the hem and apparently entirely unconcerned about it. "You cannot simply uproot a specimen without the root system," Carina was saying, between diminishing waves of laughter. "In my defense, the light was very poor and I was extremely enthusiastic. Piers, it was a nettle." Edmund became aware by gradual and unwelcome degrees that he had stopped moving entirely, that his hand had found the door frame beside him, that the quality of his stillness was not composure. Composure was a thing he chose, a deliberate and practiced state, but something less voluntary. The stillness of a man who has walked into a familiar room and cannot immediately locate the thing that has changed, but knows with absolute certainty that something has. Gwyn spotted him and swept off his hat with the fluid ease of a natural diplomat. "Your Grace, Lord Piers Gwyn. I have had the honor of corresponding with your wife for some time. She was generous enough to extend an invitation for the week. I trust I have not arrived at an inconvenience." Edmund's gaze moved from Gwyn to Carina. Carina, whose laughter had been folded away with remarkable speed into something composed and attentive, met his eyes with an expression of mild inquiry that gave absolutely nothing away. She had invited a guest to Dunmore Hall. She had, it was now apparent, not informed him. "Not at all," Edmund said, in the voice he used for parliamentary committees and creditors he did not intend to negotiate with.
Dunmore is always glad to receive guests. Arrangements will be made." He turned and walked away from both of them. He made it to his study, sat behind the great desk, and then sat without moving for an interval he did not measure, looking at nothing in particular, while his mind attempted to identify, with the methodical precision he applied to every problem he was willing to acknowledge was a problem, the precise nature of the sensation that had taken up residence in his rib-cage since the front steps. It felt, with an accuracy that was inconvenient in the extreme, like having been left out. Not betrayed, not deceived, simply left out, excluded from something warm and unguarded and alive that was happening inside his own house, in the company of a man who apparently knew 3 drafts of his wife's manuscript and the full story of an uprooted nettle, while Edmund Calder, 5th Duke of Dunmore, did not know she had a school. He picked up his pen. He put it down again. He looked at the wall. The week Piers Gwyn spent at Dunmore Hall would later be described by Corinna in a letter to her sister as instructive. This was, her sister would reply, the most characteristic understatement she had received in a decade of correspondence. On Saturday, Gwyn accompanied Corinna on the morning hedgerow survey and proved, despite the nettle, to be a genuinely useful field companion. Observant, methodical, and pleasingly willing to carry the heavy satchel without requiring the suggestion. They spent 3 hours in the northern grounds and returned with 6 new specimens, a corrected taxonomic note on the lantana that Corinna disputed within 30 seconds of his proposing it, and the easy, well-worn rapport that comes from 2 years of letters finding their proper velocity in person. Edmund, who had been conducting a tour of the western pastures with his estate manager, encountered them returning through the kitchen garden. Corinna was holding a specimen jar at arm's length and arguing. Gwyn was defending his position with cheerful insubordination and muddy boots. They were both comprehensively damp, and neither appeared to have registered this as a situation requiring attention. Edmund excused himself from his manager mid-sentence, which was not something he had done before in 20 years of managing an estate, and walked toward the house by a route that took him through the kitchen garden at a pace he did not examine. That evening at dinner, something happened that caused Piers Gwyn, a man of considerable social experience and reliable instincts, to reach for his wine-glass with unusual care and hold it there. Edmund asked a question, not a formal inquiry, not a diplomatic gesture in the direction of table conversation, a specific, direct, considered question addressed to his wife about the taxonomic dispute she and Gwyn had been conducting since their return, because he had, it emerged, spent the afternoon with Parkinson's Theatrum Botanicum open on his desk. The table went quiet, with the specific quality of quiet that follows something unexpected. Gwyn took a slow sip of his wine and said nothing. Corinna looked at her husband for a beat longer than was strictly socially neutral. "The lantana," she said, carefully, "produces its berries in clusters of precisely—" "I read Parkinson," Edmund said. "I disagree with your marginal annotation on page 47. She stared at him. "You read my annotations. You wrote in my book. You said the shelving was organized by frequency of consultation. You consulted it that afternoon." Edmund reached for his wine-glass with the precise, deliberate motion of a man in measured retreat from something he has accidentally disclosed. "Parkinson is an important text." Gwyn set down his fork with the quiet air of a man in the process of revising an entire theory he had arrived with. He was, at his core, a man of good instincts and better character, and both served him well that evening in the candle-lit dining-room of Dunmore Hall, where something quiet and irreversible was occurring at the head of the table that had nothing whatsoever to do with hedgerow taxonomy. Tuesday's lesson had never before had an audience. Gwyn had departed on Sunday with the cheerful good grace of a man who has genuinely enjoyed his week and genuinely means his farewell, pressing Corinna's hand warmly at the carriage step and telling her, with a sincerity she did not doubt, that the book would be magnificent and that he expected a copy with a personal inscription. He had shaken Edmund's hand, held his gaze for a moment with the frank and unornamented assessment of one intelligent man measuring another, and climbed into his yellow curricle without looking back. Corinna had watched him go from the front steps with the particular feeling of a chapter ending, not sadly, but with the clear-eyed recognition that it had been what it was and was now complete. Edmund had stood beside her on the steps and said nothing, but he had not gone in until the curricle had rounded the end of the drive and disappeared entirely, which was not, she noted, nothing. Now it was Tuesday, 9:30, and the 9 girls arrived in their usual cascade, coats and noise, and the specific energy of children who have been doing arithmetic in their heads since they woke, because their teacher has made arithmetic feel like a puzzle worth solving. They hung their coats on their hooks, sorted themselves into their chairs, arranged their slates with the practiced routine of a classroom that has been a classroom long enough to have developed its own customs. Then His Grace the Duke of Dunmore walked in. He had come, as Corinna had noted immediately, in his everyday clothes, the dark riding coat, plain linen, no formal indicators of rank beyond the bearing that was simply his, inseparable from him, the physical vocabulary of a man accustomed to being the final authority in any room he entered. In the bright, chalky, purposeful atmosphere of the north wing parlor, surrounded by 9 small girls and their slates, he looked rather like a standing stone that had wandered in from the moors, ancient, solid, slightly uncertain of how it had arrived. Millicent Forge looked him up and down with an assessment so thorough and unabashed that the girl beside her tugged urgently at her sleeve. Edmund met Millicent's gaze with the gravity the situation apparently demanded. Corinna said "good morning" to the room, with the calm of a woman who has decided to treat the extraordinary as ordinary, and the lesson began. Today she took them outside. She led them along the north path to the hedgerow, 9 girls in wool coats and stout boots, Corinna in her brown gown with the ink-stained cuff and her canvas satchel on her shoulder, and Edmund followed 3 paces behind them all, his hands clasped at his back, his face holding the expression of a man who is recalibrating his understanding of the world at a frequency he has not previously needed to engage. "What do you observe?" Corinna asked, crouching at the hedgerow with the ease of long habit. "Berries," said Harriet. "Red ones and some black ones," offered another. "Are they the same berry at different ages?" Millicent asked. Corinna looked at Millicent with the particular brightness she reserved for excellent questions, a brightness so unguarded and complete that it transformed her face entirely into something that had no relationship to the composed, careful woman of the dinner table or the corridor. "That, Millicent, is precisely the right thing to ask. What does everyone else think?" The girls gathered close. A spirited argument broke out over the berries, conducted with the passionate, glorious illogic of 8-year-olds who have been given permission to have actual opinions, while Corinna moderated with the deft, joyful skill of someone for whom this is not management, but pure pleasure. Edmund watched from 3 paces back. He watched for 40 minutes without moving, unobserved, observing. He watched Corinna redirect an argument between Harriet and a girl named Constance about whether robins preferred the red berries or the black, with a single question so precisely chosen that both girls immediately forgot they had been arguing and began instead to think. He watched her draw a diagram in her notebook and hold it at the exact height of the shortest girl present. He watched her correct a misconception with a patience that contained no trace of condescension, only the steady, generous attention of someone who finds the process of another person understanding something genuinely delightful.
And then Pearl Moss, the small, dark-eyed 6-year-old who took in the world with an accuracy that Corinna had told him at dinner on Saturday, with a warmth she had not appeared to notice she was displaying, was going to astonish people when the world got around to paying attention, asked whether the birds who ate the berries would plant new hedges somewhere far away. Corinna stopped. She turned to Pearl and crouched to the child's precise height, bringing herself level with those dark, serious eyes, and she said, with the full and complete seriousness that the question deserved, "Pearl, you have just described the entire science of seed dispersal. Come here and let me show you exactly what you mean." Edmund looked at his wife's face in that moment, the open, undefended, radiant attention of it, the complete absence of any of the careful layers she wore in his presence, and felt something give way in the cold and well-maintained architecture of himself. Not dramatically, not with the violence of sudden understanding, but with the slow, irresistible quality of frost leaving ground in early spring, a yielding so gradual it cannot be located at any single point, and yet the result, when it has finished, is unmistakable. He had shared a house with this woman for 5 years. He had not known her at all. The walk back to the hall was quiet, the girls running ahead in pairs, their voices carrying back on the cold air. Corinna walked without hurrying, her satchel on her shoulder, her color high from the cold, her notebook open in her hand as she made a quick record of the morning's observations in her small and serious handwriting. She did not speak to him. He did not speak to her. But at the north wing door, as the girls collected their coats from the hooks in the cheerful chaos of departure, Edmund paused beside her in the doorway while the corridor emptied around them. He stood for a moment in the particular way he had when a decision had been made and required only its expression. "Next Thursday," he said. She looked up at him from her notebook. "I will be here next Thursday," he said, "if that is acceptable." He held her gaze steadily. "I will not be late." Corinna studied him for a long moment, with that careful, unhurried attention she had given the hedgerow specimen in the November frost, measuring what was there rather than what she had anticipated finding. Then something in her expression moved, fractionally, in a direction he could not yet fully read, but which he understood with the certainty of a man who has learned to be accurate about the things that matter, was not unwelcoming.
"The lesson begins at 9:30, she said. "The girls do not wait, and neither do I." She walked back into the parlor to straighten the chairs. Edmund stood in the empty doorway for a moment, the sounds of the house returning around him, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the girls' voices fading down the corridor, the wind against the north wing's old stone, and felt, with the bewildering and inconvenient force of a truth that has been true for some time before its owner notices, that he had just been handed something he had done absolutely nothing to deserve and everything he needed to earn. He intended, on the evidence of this morning, to begin immediately. He arrived at the North Wing parlor the following Thursday at 9:20, so as to be certain, with a precision bordering on the superstitious, that he would not, under any circumstances, be late. If you're enjoying this story, kindly share the video with someone who deserves to watch something this good. Now back to the story. He was not late. Karina arrived at the North Wing parlour at 9:25 to find Edmund already there, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind him, studying the arrangement of the room with the focused, slightly humbled expression of a man encountering a foreign country whose customs he intends to respect. He had not worn his formal coat. She noticed this immediately. He was in his everyday riding clothes, dark wool, simple cut, no decorative frogging, no signet ring. The effect was disconcerting. He looked less like the 5th Duke of Dunmore and more like a man who had made a deliberate decision to take up less space. The girls arrived in their usual cascade of coats and noise and nearly trampled him. He stepped aside with a dexterity that suggested old military reflexes, and Millicent Forge, who had apparently decided overnight that the Duke was an interesting specimen rather than an alarming one, stopped directly in front of him and said without preamble, "Can you read?" Edmund looked down at her. "I can," he said. "Can you read well?" she pressed. "Miss Lockard says there is a difference between reading the words and reading the meaning." A pause of perhaps 3 seconds. "I am still working on the second," Edmund said gravely. Millicent considered this, apparently found it satisfactory, and took her seat. Corinna, who had witnessed this exchange from the doorway with her notebook pressed to her sternum like a shield, made a decision to say nothing about it, and proceeded to begin the lesson. Today was arithmetic. Corinna taught it through the medium of field measurement, how to calculate the area of a hedgerow section, how to record specimen counts, how to detect an anomaly in a data set. The girls worked in pairs with slates and chalk, arguing cheerfully over their figures. Edmund sat at the far end of the long table, which placed him beside Pearl, the tiny 6-year-old who had asked about seed dispersal the previous week. Pearl, with the unself-consciousness of the very young, pushed her slate across the table toward him within 5 minutes. "I have 11, she whispered, with evident doubt. "Is 11 right?" Edmund looked at the slate, then at Pearl. Then, with the slightly arrested quality of a man who has not been asked a simple question requiring a simple answer in a very long time, he looked at the figures properly. "You have 12, he said quietly. "You missed one in the 2nd column. Here," he pointed. Pearl counted again, lips moving. Her face opened like a window. "Oh!" She corrected it with the total absorption of a child for whom a sum clicking into place is an event of genuine satisfaction. "Thank you," she said, and patted his hand once with her small ink-stained one before returning to her work. Edmund did not move his hand for a full 30 seconds. Corinna saw it. She was explaining a figure to Harriet on the opposite side of the table, and she saw it. The arrested stillness, the way he looked at his own hand afterward, as though something small and irrefusable had occurred upon its surface, and he was only now understanding the nature of the event. She turned back to Harriet, but her throat had tightened in a way that required a deliberate moment to resolve, and when she looked up again to address the room, she found that Edmund was watching her, not with his usual administrative attention, not with the studied neutrality of their dinner-table silences, but with an expression so unguarded and so searching that she felt it register somewhere beneath her ribs before she had time to prepare a defense against it. She looked away first. For the first time in 5 years, she was not entirely certain that was the right choice. The spring quarterly of the Royal Botanical Society arrived in the libraries of every great house in the north of England on the 14th of March, and Corinna knew 3 days before it came that she was frightened. She had known for weeks that publication was approaching, had felt its slow arrival the way one feels a change in weather, a tightening of the air, a shift in pressure that the body registers before the mind finds language for it. She had told no one, not Gwyn, who had returned to Wales after his week at Dunmore with the philosophical good grace of a man who has accurately read a situation, and certainly not Edmund, with whom she had developed, over the course of 3 Thursday lessons and 1 long conservatory evening that she had not yet fully examined, a careful, tentative, entirely unclassified new register of conversation. She had told no one because she could not fully explain, even to herself, why the thing she had worked hardest for in her life also frightened her so thoroughly. To be seen, truly seen, not as the Duke of Dunmore's wife, not as the vicar's clever daughter, not as a footnote to someone else's story, but as Corinna Vane, author. Her name, her conclusions standing alone in the full and permanent light of institutional scrutiny, available to be agreed with, disagreed with, praised, dismissed, misunderstood, permanent, irrevocable, hers. It was everything she had wanted. It was absolutely terrifying. She was in the still room, pressing a late specimen, when Mrs. Orren appeared in the doorway wearing the expression of suppressed significant news that Corinna had learned over 5 years to read with precision. "His Grace would like you to join him in the library, Your Grace, when convenient." Edmund was standing when she entered, unusual enough to note, as he nearly always sat when they spoke, as though deliberate stillness might reduce the volatility of any given exchange. He stood at the window, his back to her, and on the desk behind him lay the open quarterly. He turned when he heard her. His expression was not readable in any of the ways she had catalogued over 5 years. It was something new, interior, careful, weighted with quality she could not immediately name because she had not, until recently, seen him permit himself enough vulnerability for it to have a name. "I read it this morning," he said. "All of it." He held her gaze steadily. "The entire paper." Corinna waited. "The methodology," he said. "The longitudinal data across the northern elevations, the corrected classification notes on the lantana." He paused. "I did not understand all of it." "No one expects—" "I intend to understand all of it," he said, "if you are willing to explain the sections I could not follow." The still room, the hedgerow in November rain, the 5 years of breakfasts at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 20, the hand that had not moved for 30 seconds that morning while Pearl patted it. "You want me to teach you," she said slowly. "I want to understand your work," he said. "There is a distinction. The first implies I require instruction. The second implies I find the subject worth the effort." He met her eyes without looking away. "I find it worth the effort." The afternoon light fell between them in long, pale bars, full of dust and stillness, and the particular quality of an hour that is offering something that may not be offered again in the same form. "Friday afternoon," Corinna said at last. "Bring your own copy. Mine has annotations I am not yet ready to share." The faintest alteration moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the structural foundation upon which one might be carefully, incrementally built. "Friday," he said. Society arrived at Dunmore Hall in the form of Lady Cecily Morven on the 22nd of March, which is to say that trouble came, as it usually does, in a very well-appointed carriage. Lady Morven was 53, formidably connected, and had devoted her considerable intelligence to the maintenance of social hierarchies with the same rigor that Corinna devoted to field botany. She was not cruel, precisely. She was something more efficient than cruel. She was certain. Certain of how things ought to be, of who ought to do which things, and of the particular disorder that resulted when women of good family published papers in scientific journals under their own names, as though this were a perfectly ordinary occurrence requiring no special comment. She had come ostensibly to stop on her way north to her daughter's confinement. She had come actually to form an opinion and disseminate it. The first evening passed without incident. Corinna was composed and warm and said nothing that could be collected and deployed against her. Edmund was his usual impeccably mannered self at the head of the table. Lady Morven, for her part, was an accomplished conversationalist and kept to safe harbours, road conditions, parliamentary business, the unreliability of the northern spring. The second day she asked to see the house. Corinna had anticipated the north wing. She had closed the parlour before the tour began, prepared a perfectly adequate explanation involving storage reorganization. What she had not anticipated was Mrs. Oran, who possessed the innocent and catastrophic helpfulness of a woman who believes transparency is always a virtue in domestic matters, directing Lady Morven's inquiring attention toward the row of small coat-hooks visible through the briefly opened parlour door. "What a curious quantity of hooks for a storage room," Lady Morven observed, with the pleasant precision of a woman who never says directly what she could accomplish more effectively by implication. That evening at dinner she raised it. "I understand, Duchess, that you have been conducting some manner of educational program for village children." The pause before children carried an entire editorial within it. "A reading school," Corinna said evenly. "Yes." "For girls?" "Primarily." Lady Morven set down her fork with the gentle precision of someone who finds the cutlery considerably less objectionable than the conversation. "My dear, I wonder if you have considered the implications. The Countess of Weston attempted something similar in Surrey, and the resulting expectations among the tenant families became rather pronounced. People begin to want things, you understand, when they are given the tools to imagine wanting them." The table was very quiet. Corinna drew breath. Edmund spoke first. "That," he said, in the flat, final register that had silenced parliamentary committees and halted hostile negotiations across 2 countries, "is precisely the point." Lady Morven turned to him. "The children of Dunmore's tenant families are an asset to this estate," he continued, with the measured calm of a man who has made up his mind before he began speaking and is therefore immune to interruption. "My wife's school is a program of estate improvement. I am its patron." A silence of the particular quality that follows the unexpected and public redrawing of a line. Lady Morven recovered with admirable speed. "How very progressive, Your Grace." "How very practical," Edmund corrected pleasantly. Under the table, entirely hidden by the long white cloth, Corinna's hand had found the edge of her chair and was holding it rather hard. He had not told her he was going to say that. He had also, she registered this with a jolt that required careful management, just publicly declared himself patron of a school he had not known existed 5 weeks ago. She did not look at him until Lady Morven had been successfully redirected toward the dessert course. When she did, he was regarding his plate with the expression of a decided man who has nothing to add and no intention of unsaying anything. Under the table, Corinna released the chair, and with her free hand, very deliberately, found the edge of the tablecloth, pressed her fingers against the linen, steadied herself against the unexpected, unwelcome, and entirely inconvenient warmth that had taken up residence somewhere beneath her composure, and showed no intention of leaving. She found him there by accident. It was past 11. Lady Morven had retired. The house had folded into its nighttime vocabulary of settling timber and distant wind, and Corinna, too restless to sleep and too honest with herself to pretend otherwise, had taken a candle and gone to the conservatory to check on a seedling tray she had been monitoring for germination. Edmund was sitting on the iron bench at the far end, in the dark, without a candle. She stopped in the doorway. The single flame in her hand threw his shadow large against the glass walls, and beyond the glass the moonlit grounds of Dunmore lay silver and entirely still, as though the estate itself were holding its breath. "Forgive me," she said. "I didn't know you were here." "Don't go." The words came immediately, before his usual deliberation could catch and reshape them, and she heard him register this, a brief pause following, as though he were reordering something that had come out in the wrong sequence. "That is, the conservatory is yours. I will move." "You were here first." "I am often here at this hour." He said it in the matter-of-fact way of a man disclosing something inadvertently, without yet understanding that the disclosure itself is the thing of consequence. "It is quiet." Corinna looked at him, at the angles of his face in the candlelight, the shadows beneath his eyes that had been deepening over recent weeks, the particular posture of a man whose body has forgotten how to rest and has made a separate and uneasy peace with the fact. She crossed the conservatory and sat at the opposite end of the bench, angled toward the glass. She set the candle on the potting shelf. Between them lay perhaps 3 feet of iron bench and 5 years of untraversed distance, and the moonlight lay across both with perfect indifference. "You don't sleep," she said, not a question. "Rarely, since the peninsula. The dark takes some managing." She had not known this. 5 years in the same house, and she had not known. "Is that why you work so late?" she asked. "Partially," a pause that contained more than the word that followed it. "Partially because an empty study is preferable to an empty room." The candle flame moved in some unfelt current of air, throwing shadows that rearranged themselves against the glass and settled again. "Edmund," she said. This was only the second time in their marriage she had used his given name without either irony or deliberate performance, and they both understood the weight of the distinction. Why did we never speak to each other? It was not quite a question. It was the thing she had asked herself in the dark of the East Wing for 5 years, finally said aloud to the person it concerned, and the air in the conservatory altered the moment the words left her. He was silent long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I didn't know how to," he said finally. "That is not an excuse. It is simply the truth. I had spent 10 years before our marriage in the company of men and orders and clearly defined objectives." He paused. "You were none of those things. You were—" He stopped. "Bewildering," she offered. "Extraordinary," he said, very quietly, "from the very beginning, and I did not know what to do with something I could not manage or improve or fix, so I retreated." "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap, the ink stain on the left cuff, silver in the moonlight. "I knocked on your study door. Do you remember? In the first month. I brought you tea and a question about the estate's hedgerow boundary lines, because I thought it might be a point of common ground between us." "I told you to leave it with the footman," he said, very low. "You told me to leave it with the footman." The conservatory received this in silence. "I know," he said. The 2 words carried the specific gravity of a man who has been carrying a particular understanding for a long time and has finally set it down in the only room where it can be properly examined. "Corinna, I know what I did." She looked at him. His face in the candlelight was not the face of the Duke of Dunmore. It was the face of a man of 39 who is tired and honestly sorry and does not know if sorry is a currency that still holds any value in this particular account. "I don't want an apology," she said carefully. "I stopped needing apologies some time ago. They are a resolution that doesn't actually resolve anything." She paused, selecting the words with the same precision she brought to field notation. "What I want to know is what you actually want, Edmund, now, from this." He held her gaze without flinching. "I want to know you," he said. "All of it. The school and the hedgerows and the annotations I am not permitted to read, and what you think about when you go quiet. The paper, the letters to Gwyn, the reason you check the seedling tray at midnight." He exhaled, not dramatically, but with the slow deliberateness of a man who has been holding something he has been holding too tightly for too long. "I want to be worth knocking on." Her breath moved through her carefully, navigating new and unmapped terrain. "That," she said after a long moment, "is an honest answer." She rose, took her candle from the potting shelf, and walked toward the doorway. At the threshold she paused, her back to him, the flame steady in her hand. "The seedling tray needs checking again on Tuesday," she said. "You could come, if you wished." She walked out into the dark corridor, but she left the candle on the potting shelf behind her. The flame burned on in the conservatory, throwing its small, faithful circle of gold across the iron bench, and Edmund Calder sat within it for a long time, in the quiet company of its light. April came to Dunmore with the tentative, apologetic quality of a season that knows it follows a hard winter and is not yet certain of its welcome. The Tuesday seedling check became a standing arrangement, unremarked upon by either party, observed by both with the careful mutual respect of people who have learned that the surest way to destroy a fragile thing is to name it too soon. Friday afternoons, Corina taught Edmund the methodology of her paper across the width of the library desk, and he proved to be, infuriatingly, unexpectedly, with no apparent effort, an excellent student. Disciplined, precise, capable of following a taxonomic argument through 3 levels of abstraction and emerging on the other side with intelligent objections that required actual thought to address. He was also, she was discovering in the marginal spaces of these encounters, quietly funny. Not performatively so. The humor surfaced without announcement, a dry observation about Parkinson's taxonomic confidence, a single raised eyebrow at a particularly forceful claim in her own methodology, and it had the disorienting quality of something she had not at all prepared to find appealing about the specific human being who had been her husband for 5 years. She began to look forward to Fridays. She examined this fact once, briefly, and then elected to leave it alone in the same way one leaves a bruise, aware of its presence, disinclined to press. On the second Thursday of April, she arrived at the North Wing parlor to find that Edmund had preceded her by what was evidently a full half-hour. He had rearranged the nature cards on the long table, not randomly, but reorganized into the precise taxonomic system she used in her own paper notebooks, cross-referenced with illustrated examples she had not provided, but that he had, apparently, sourced himself from a volume in the library that she had never mentioned, and he had therefore found by his own industry. Pearl was already there. She had arrived early, as she sometimes did, finding some particular comfort in the room before the other girls filled it, and was sitting beside Edmund with her slate, while he gravely explained, in terms clearly calibrated to the understanding of a 6-year-old, why the cards were arranged the way they were. "The ones that grow in the dark go here," Edmund was saying, pointing, "and the ones that need the sun go here. And the ones that can manage either, those go in the middle, because they are the most adaptable." Pearl considered this with great seriousness. "I would go in the middle." "Would you?"
"I am adaptable," Pearl said, with perfect solemnity. Edmund considered her answer with the same gravity she had offered it. "I think you are right."
Corinna stood in the doorway for longer than was warranted by any practical need. Then she went in and began the lesson, and the morning proceeded as mornings do when something important is occurring beneath the surface of ordinary things, brightly, noisily, in the company of children who noticed none of it and thereby permitted it to exist. That afternoon, alone in the still room, while the light moved slowly across the stone floor, Corinna opened the letter from the London literary press that had been sitting in her correspondence box for 3 days. A full volume, her name on the spine, 6 months of intensive work, access to collections in Edinburgh and London, extended periods away from Dunmore. She read it twice. Then she folded it with hands that were entirely steady, which meant, she knew from experience, that something significant was being processed at a depth below the reach of ordinary composure. She did not need his permission. This had never been in question and was not now. She had built her work, her school, her correspondence network, and her inner life without requiring endorsement from anyone, and she was not about to alter that fundamental architecture on the basis of a conservatory conversation, however honest, and a reorganized set of nature cards, however inexplicably moving. But she was aware, with the particular reluctant clarity of a woman who has trained herself to observe accurately, even when the observation is inconvenient, that she did not want to leave without telling him, not because she needed his response, because somewhere between November and April, in the accumulated currency of margin notes and seedling trays and the unmoving hand, his response had become something she wanted. She put the letter in her apron pocket and went to find her husband. She found him in the conservatory again, though it was not midnight but early evening, the sky outside the glass washed to a tender, exhausted gold, the grounds of Dunmore lying quiet beneath it in the particular peace of an April dusk that has earned its warmth. He was doing nothing in particular, which was itself a thing she had rarely seen, sitting with a book open and unread in his hand, watching the light change over the northern grounds, with an expression she had recently begun to recognize as his version of contentment. Not happiness, precisely, she was not sure he had a reliable grammar for happiness yet, but the nearest available equivalent. The face of a man who is, for the first time in a long time, not braced against anything. She sat beside him, closer than the last time. The bench was the same bench, but 3 feet had become 18 inches without either of them formally negotiating the distance, and neither of them commented on it now. She drew the letter from her pocket and told him plainly and without any softening of the edges, the publisher, the scope, the timeline, the travel. She told him what it would mean for her work and what it had cost her in nerve to send that first unsolicited submission 14 months ago, and she told him, because the conservatory version of herself was the only version she could now manage in his presence with anything approaching honesty, that she was frightened. Of what? He asked. She looked at her hands where they lay in her lap, bare and ink-stained and entirely her own. Of being fully visible, she said. It is a paradox I have never satisfactorily resolved. I have fought my entire life against invisibility, against being the vicar's daughter, the duke's wife, the anonymous correspondent. And now that something real and permanent and entirely mine is within reach, she paused. There is a kind of safety in a locked door, from the inside as well as the outside. I did not fully understand that until recently. Edmund was very still beside her. The gold light was fading in slow, gentle increments across the glass above them. "You should do it," he said. "I know. I mean that specifically." He turned to her, fully with the deliberate openness she had watched him practice over recent weeks, like a man relearning a language his body had forgotten. "I mean that I will manage here. The school, I will oversee it in your absence with Mrs. Oren. The girls know me now. A brief pause. "Pearl has formally informed me that I am acceptable." Despite the letter in her hand and the 6 months of absence it contained, and everything she did not yet know how to say, Karina made a sound that was nearly a laugh. "That is the highest endorsement available in this household." "I am aware of that." He held her gaze steadily. "I am also aware that I have no right to ask you to consider anything beyond the book. I forfeited that right somewhere in the first month of our marriage, and have been living in the resulting deficit ever since, and I have no intention of compounding the debt by asking you to weigh your work against my comfort." He paused, and in the pause she could see the effort it cost him, the precise, deliberate courage of a man for whom this register of speech is newly acquired and still uncertain. "But I want to ask it anyway. When you return, I would like the door to be open." The last of the gold light was going, gentle and unhurried, the way good things end when they are not taken from you but merely pass. "Which door?" she said, very quietly. He looked at her, the full, undefended look she had learned over these weeks to distinguish from all his other varieties of attention. "All of them," he said, "beginning with mine." The conservatory held them in its warm and breathing silence, the first stars appearing in the darkening glass above, and Karina studied his face, the weathered planes of it, the honest fatigue, the patient and offered openness of a man who has finally understood that what he wants cannot be managed or improved or fixed, only asked for, with the full and unprotected vulnerability of someone who does not yet know the answer. She had armored herself against exactly this, carefully, rationally, with 5 years of very good reasons. The armor was not holding. She reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration, simply, her ink-stained fingers laid over his in the early evening light in the conservatory of Dunmore Hall, with the first stars coming on above them and the grounds going quietly to silver beyond the glass. He turned his hand over and held hers. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Some resolutions do not require language. They require only the steady, mutual willingness to remain in the same room with something true. She left for Edinburgh on the 1st of May in a well-appointed carriage with 3 trunks of field notes and specimen cases and 1 leather satchel of books that included, she could not have fully explained this and did not try to, a slim volume on northern estate management that Edmund had been annotating through the spring, which she found on the conservatory bench the morning of her departure with a note tucked inside the front cover. "In case the northern elevations of Scotland require comparison, the margin notes are yours if you want them. Come home when the work is done. Dunmore will be here. I will be here. E." He had not come to the front steps to see her off. She had not asked him to. They were still, both of them, learning the new grammar of this thing between them, where the words were and where the silence served better. And she had understood without discussion that a public farewell would require of him an effort she did not need to witness to believe in. She had knocked on his study door at 7 in the morning. He had opened it himself, not called for her to enter, not directed the footman, but risen from his desk and crossed the room and opened the door with his own hand, which was, she had come to understand, the register in which Edmund Calder expressed the things that exceeded his vocabulary. They had stood in the doorway, her in her traveling coat, him with his morning coffee, the waking house moving quietly around them. "The lantana," he said, "will need monitoring through June." "I know," she said. "I have left detailed notes for Mrs. Oran." "Safe travels, Corinna." "Thank you, Edmund." She had gone. Edinburgh was extraordinary. The collections at the Royal College of Surgeons exceeded every hope she had permitted herself. The correspondence network she had built through the Botanical Society opened doors with an efficiency she was still learning to fully trust, and the work, the deep, daily, consuming labor of a book finding its shape, was the closest approximation of joy she had a reliable name for. She wrote to him twice a week, botanical observations at first, the particular quality of the Scottish light on specimen glass, a note on the elevated taxonomic variants she was finding in the northern collections, methodological questions she was working through and had not yet resolved. By the third week, the letters changed. She wrote about the light over Edinburgh's old town at dawn, how it fell across the stone differently from Dunmore's limestone, harder, more austere, as though the city had opinions about being beautiful and declined to make it easy. She wrote about an elderly Scots naturalist she had encountered in the college library, a man of 70 with magnificent white side whiskers and a complete intolerance for imprecise language, who reminded her, she admitted this directly without softening it, of Edmund in his better moments. She wrote about Pearl, and whether she had asked anything interesting lately, and whether Millicent had yet conceded the disputed point about the Lantana cluster count. He wrote back, every letter, without exception or delay. His letters were spare and precise, and quietly full of things she had not known him to be capable of committing to paper, which meant, she understood, reading them in the Edinburgh lamplight, that he had not previously known it either. He described the Thursday lessons with the careful attention of a man recording something he intends not to lose. He described Pearl's most recent question, which had concerned whether worms felt the rain, and his attempt to provide a scientifically accurate answer to a 6-year-old. He described the morning hedgerow as spring advanced toward summer, using the observational vocabulary she had been teaching him, and deploying it with a precision that made her set the letter down once in the middle of a sentence to look at the ceiling of her Edinburgh lodgings for a moment before continuing. In the 6th week, he wrote about the night of the knock. "I had not intended to knock. I want you to know that, though I am not entirely sure what I want you to do with the knowledge. I had come upstairs with your letter from the Botanical Society, the acceptance letter, which I had opened in error and then read in something that was not error, and could not deceive myself that it was. I stood outside your door, and I raised my hand, and I knocked, and when you did not answer, I stood in that corridor for longer than I have admitted to anyone, including myself, understanding for the first time with genuine clarity that I had built a house with a woman in it, and had never once gone to find out what she had made of the rooms I gave her. The silence on the other side of your door was the most instructive thing that had happened to me in years. I am grateful for it. I am grateful for you. I am not yet fluent in saying so, but I find that I am practicing with increasing conviction." She folded that letter and placed it inside the front cover of his estate annotations volume, against the note he had left on the conservatory bench. She came home in October. The hedgerows were turning, the first cold coming in from the north, and Dunmore Hall rose against the iron sky at the end of the long drive, precisely as it always had, stone and austere and enduring, unchanged by her absence, unchanged by anything, in the way that only very old and very solid things can afford to be. Edmund was on the front steps. He had come out to meet her, which she had not expected and had not asked for, and he stood in his everyday coat in the grey October afternoon with the particular constrained attention of a man who has been watching the end of a long drive and will not permit himself to call what he has been doing by the name that most accurately describes it. She stepped down from the carriage. They stood 6 feet apart on the gravel, while the coachman unloaded trunks and the household waited at a respectful remove, and the cold wind moved through the turning trees lining the drive with the clean, indifferent energy of a season that has no investment in human resolution and will arrive regardless. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She crossed the 6 feet. He met her halfway, so that when they arrived at the same point, it was not her going to him or him coming to her, but both of them moving simultaneously toward the middle ground, which was, she thought, exactly the right geometry for everything that came after. Edmund Calder placed his hands on either side of his wife's face with the careful, wondering reverence of a man who has finally understood the precise value of something he spent 5 years failing to notice, and kissed her, slowly, deliberately, without drama and without the careful management of distance that had governed every exchange between them for half a decade. In the full sight of his household, the October sky, and the unimpressed turning trees. When he drew back, she was looking at him with the gray-green gaze he had spent the summer learning the full vocabulary of through letters and lamplight and the persistent, faithful company of her margin notes. "The book," he said. "Is it finished?"
"First draft," she said. "It needs 6 more months of revision." "Here," he said, with the quiet certainty of a decided man. "The revision happens here." "The revision happens wherever I choose," she said, with perfect pleasantness. He looked at her, and then, finally, fully, without reservation or management, he smiled. Not the structural foundation of one, not the approximation, the real thing, arriving on his face with the slightly unsteady quality of something that has been away a long time and is not yet certain of its footing, but has come home nonetheless. "Yes," he said, "it does." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked into Dunmore Hall together, through the front door, which stood open to the October afternoon, open to the cold and the gold and the turning year, and neither of them looked back at it. The East Wing bedchamber was repurposed the following spring. Not immediately. These things take time, the unlocking of a room, the patient archaeology of 2 people learning to share space they have long divided by unspoken agreement and the accumulated habits of distance. But by April, Corinna's writing desk had been moved to the large room at the corner of the south wing, the one with 2 windows, one facing the hedgerow and one facing the drive, which became, by common and entirely uncontested agreement, her study. Edmund had carried the desk himself, with the focused physical care of a man for whom the action was not about furniture. Northern Hedgerow Flora, a field study of medicinal and ecological properties by Corinna Vane, Duchess of Dunmore, was published in the autumn of the following year. The dedication page read simply, "To E, who learned to read the meaning, and to the girls of Dunmore, who always knew how." Edmund's copy, which Corinna eventually retrieved from the library for her own reference purposes, contained more annotations than any other volume in the room, small, careful, admiring notes in his precise hand that constituted, across 214 pages, a kind of love letter that had found its form because he had no other shape available to it. She read every one. She read them in the south wing study, at the desk he had carried up the stairs, with the hedgerow visible from one window and the drive from the other, and the sounds of the north wing lesson drifting up on Tuesday and Thursday mornings from below, because the school had expanded, adding a second room and a second morning each week, and, in its 3rd year, a dedicated teacher paid from the Dunmore estate accounts, without discussion and without fanfare, simply listed in the household ledger under estate improvement, which was exactly what it was.
Two of its first students went on to extraordinary things. Millicent Forge became a schoolmistress in Leeds, where she taught arithmetic through field measurement to children who had never seen a hedgerow, and who found in the method the same bright utility their teacher had discovered at a long table in the north wing of a northern manor house at the age of 8. Pearl Moss became a botanical illustrator whose precise and luminous work appeared in 3 scientific journals over the course of a long career, and who kept on the wall above her own drafting desk a small pressed specimen of Viburnum lantana in a glass frame, beside a note in a Duchess's handwriting that read, "You have just described the entire science of seed dispersal." Pearl kept both of these things until the end of her life. Edmund learned to sleep through the dark. Not always, and not without effort, but with sufficient regularity that the conservatory bench saw less of him at midnight, though he returned to it sometimes in the company of his wife, when the moon was full and the grounds lay silver beyond the glass, and there was something to be said that was better said in the quiet than in the bright, complicated business of the day. He never stopped annotating her books. She never stopped leaving her work on his desk, slightly too casually, in the way of a woman who has learned that "I value your opinion" is a thing she is capable of demonstrating without it costing her the whole of her independence, which she kept burnished and intact and entirely her own until the last day of a long and well-occupied life. The east wing door remained on its hinges, unlocked. Neither of them ever mentioned it directly, which was unnecessary, because some facts require no ceremony. They require only the daily, ordinary, revolutionary act of being true. The house remembered all of it. The knock in November, the 9 small coats on the hooks, the candle left burning on the potting shelf. Dunmore was that kind of house, old enough and solid enough to absorb the weight of human change without altering its face, and patient enough to hold the memory of a locked door and an unanswered knock long after both had become the story the family told about where it had actually begun. Not with the marriage, not with the letter, with the silence on the other side of a door, and one man finally understanding what it meant, and one woman deciding, with the full, clear-eyed agency that had governed every important decision of her life, that she would give him the chance to learn. That is the story of the Duke of Dunmore and the woman who refused to be invisible. A woman who built a school, published a paper, and waited not out of weakness, but out of the particular, sovereign patience of someone who knows exactly what she is worth and will not settle for less. If this story reached you, if you felt the knock on that door, or the hand on the iron bench, or the 6 feet crossed on a gravel drive in October, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe right now so you never miss a story. Share this video with the person in your life who deserves to watch something this good, and leave a comment below. We want to know which moment was the one that made you certain Edmund was going to be worth it. Was it the margin notes, Pearl's hand, or the 6 feet he crossed without being asked? We read every single comment, every single one.